Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for the beginning of chapter 15, the Renaissance and Reformation. And in this first section, we're going to talk about the Italian Renaissance and kind of the birth of the Renaissance. So we're going to begin by talking a little bit about where the Italian Renaissance began. And it actually really probably focused more on the city of Florence, Italy. And during this period of time, there had been growth of cities, there was an increase in trade, there was also new wealth. Some of this from the Medici family, who actually lived in Florence and were people who made their wealth from the banking industry that kind of developed during the Middle Ages. And anyway, this wealth in society and in the cities stimulated the beginning of the Renaissance. And I want you to take a look kind of at this photo of Florence. In the middle of it, there is this dome. That is the dome of the cathedral that is located in Florence. It was built kind of at the start of the Renaissance period, so kind of in the middle of the 14th century. Anyway, this dome was designed by a man named Filippo Brunelleschi Nesci, and he is actually considered to be one of the fathers of the Renaissance, and it has everything to do with the design of this dome. Before domes were actually very difficult to design on an engineering side, but this dome is about the same diameter or equal to size to the dome that was designed in the Roman Empire at a place called the Parthenon. What's interesting is the designer here did not use any scaffolding. If you remember some of the architecture of the Middle Ages, there were these flying buttresses that were very widely used to support the walls. There is none of that in this design. It took about 16 years to design it, but it really becomes kind of the focal point of the city and kind of the inspiration for a lot of the other things that are going to come during this period of time. Renaissance city-states were dominated by the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, nobles, merchants, and finally artisans. I do want to mention cities like Venice and Milan became very wealthy and very powerful during this period of time. Got to remember, Italy is not like Italy today, where it's like a unified nation. Italy back at this period of time was more of a peninsula that had lots of different city-states, very reminiscent of ancient times. So Florence, Rome, Venice, Genoa, Milan, all kind of did their own thing and had their own government and sometimes their own armies and such. So the foundation of the Italian Renaissance was based on some of the ancient ideas from the Greeks and the Romans. And in a way, it was kind of like a rebirth period for those classic ideals from the past. Humanism and also secular focus. Secular is something that is non-religious. And so we're going to start hearing more about philosophy again. And we're going to hear a little more about politics and not necessarily as much about faith, which was kind of the main focus of the Middle Ages. Humanists were the scholars who studied the classical writings of the Romans and the Greeks, and they admired this culture. Humanists believed that each person had a dignity and worth, and that people should exercise their talents through a variety of activities. People can improve themselves through the idea of education. And this kind of led to, again, this desire to show things from the past. And I want to talk a little bit about the images that you see here, particularly the one on the left-hand side, the School of Athens, which was painted by an artist named Raphael. And what's interesting is this is kind of like a tribute to the old classic Greek philosophers. Within this painting, there are basically some of the greats like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. What's interesting is a lot of these fellows, even though they were well-known Greek philosophers didn't live at the same time. So it's kind of like a montage to these folks. What's interesting is if you look down here in the corner, even Raphael paints himself into the picture, which I think is kind of cool. So anyway, you have Da Vinci, who was not only an artist, but he was also an inventor, kind of toying with science a little bit. You have Botticelli, who kind of looked back at Roman mythology and the birth of Venus. Da Vinci's portrait of Mona Lisa is probably one of the most well-known pieces of art that comes out of this period of time. And what's cool is if you move around, it seems like her eyes are following you wherever you go. And Michelangelo, when we talk about religious art, he's right in the center of all of that. So again, our great Renaissance artist, if you think about it in terms of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, you can kind of keep them straight. Your Da Vinci, your Raphael, your Donatello, and your Michelangelos. So the Renaissance took place from about 1350 to about 1550, and the use of the vernacular, which is basically the language of the people, helped bring the Renaissance ideas to a new audience who did not read Latin. And I'm going to tell you right now, even though the church, as far as the Mass was concerned, Latin was kind of the central language, there were a lot of people who were not educated. And so being able to read Latin was nearly impossible, let alone understanding it as it was spoken to them. So when people start writing in the language of the people, it makes it easier to understand the works and maybe even more likely to be possible to be shared because people might be able to read that language. Okay, I want to talk about a guy named Machiavelli, who you might see here on the bottom right-hand side. Machiavelli's views were shaped by his experiences that he saw because he saw political violence and came to believe that morals should play no part in politics. Machiavelli wrote a very famous work during this time of the Renaissance called The Prince. And just to understand, Machiavelli himself was a political philosopher, but he was also a statesman. And what's interesting is his philosophy is kind of brutal, if you think about it. He encouraged within his writings that leaders should use harsh treatment against their citizens in rival states as a way to kind of maintain power. He believed that power and ruthlessness are more useful than idealism to a ruler. So if you want to get more done, you got to be tough. This idea that a ruler must do whatever is necessary to maintain political power, even if it's cruel. I mean, this guy was pretty dark if you think about what he was saying. But this idea that the state was a separate entity in itself, or an entity in itself separate from the ruler, this actually becomes very influential as we kind of move towards the future here into a period of time that we'll eventually talk about called the Enlightenment. It's that statement that the state was an entity unto itself that is very influential to the founding fathers of the United States. This idea that the ruler itself, even though it seems like the sun sets and rises on that person, it's the country that's more important. So I think that's kind of an interesting contribution, even though his politics were a little dark. Needless to say, he's going to be a big influence. Anyway, theories of Copernicus and Galileo were also similar in that both philosophies or theories said that the sun was the center of the universe. Just so you understand, Galileo got into some trouble with that because based on the reaction of Galileo's universe theory, the Roman Catholic Church didn't agree with him and they excommunicated him. And some of the other Renaissance artists were also arrested. So it is kind of sad that this was going on. Long story short, the Catholic Church now recognizes that Galileo was right. Matter of fact, the Catholic Church actually has an observatory that is located near Tucson, Arizona, that it uses to help predict some things and is actually doing a lot of research into physics and astronomy. And we can thank Galileo for that. So even though he was excommunicated, he was actually pardoned from that many years after the fact. But certainly this was a time of great tension. Artists made numerous contributions to the Renaissance through new styles and techniques, focusing on the human personality and reviving works inspired by the Greeks and the Roman artists. So when we talk about like Michelangelo's David, this statue stands roughly 13 feet tall, and for years it stood outside. Matter of fact, that dome that we looked at it for the cathedral at Florence, it was the plan that this statue of David was going to sit right on the top of that dome. And as time went on, there was a lot of complications of trying to figure out how to get the statue up there, and a lot of people that thought that maybe it would serve a better purpose being closer to the people itself. But needless to say, this is a great work that was inspired by the old Greek and Roman artist. Anyway, wealthy patrons supported Renaissance art by purchasing this artwork, giving money to the artist and other intellectuals and musicians so that they could continue to produce this work. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, which was actually painted as a mural within a monastery, was a great inspiration. And matter of fact, you could probably go to almost any traditional Catholic home, and you're probably going to find maybe a rendering of this piece somewhere in someone's home. I know I have this in my house, but it actually personified the apostles, and in a way, kind of makes things a little more personal when we talk about the gospel. Anyway, going on to talk about Michelangelo, at the age of 24, he created the Pieta that you see there. It's a marble statue depicting the moment that Jesus is brought down from the cross and given to Mary. This is certainly a very powerful sculpture. If you've ever looked at a lot of Catholic churches, there are similar renderings of this that you might see. But needless to say, this is about the only piece of art that Michelangelo actually signed, which is kind of entertaining. But needless to say, very powerful religious piece. And as a result of that, he is going to be commissioned to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Sistine Chapel is located at the Vatican. It is actually the gathering place for the College of Cardinals when they get together to select a new pope. And what's interesting is that this piece of art, the Sistine Chapel, was really kind of interesting because it takes the stories and actually a lot of the scripture out of the book of Genesis, and it personifies that. It's contains the characterizations of biblical figures. I'm going to pull this up a little closer so you can see it better. But there's a lot of myths that go along with this. First is that the scaffolding was set up for Michelangelo and he laid on his back to paint this. Truth is, the scaffolding was set about 7 feet below the top of the ceiling, and he stood with his neck kind of cranked upwards to paint this. And it took him several years to do it. He actually painted it into the wet plaster, which, obviously makes this work very delicate, a little more permanent. In the last 20 years, there has been a little bit of restoration that's been done on this. There was a time that's one of the popes obviously did not like all the nudity, and so they strategically placed certain things in places to make it a little bit more, I guess you could say, respectable at times. During the restoration that took place in the last 20 years, some of that was removed to restore it to its original grandeur. And certainly this is a very beautiful work, and it really kind of highlights everything that encompasses the High Renaissance. So thank you very much.